listen to it on audio. You say, well, I can't really absorb that. Now, hopefully, I got elders in here, but this is not bad. I grew up listening to Leonard Skinner. All right, and I listen to Leonard Skinner, and I tell my boys, maybe this is bad. I say, I can tell you the word to every Leonard Skinner song. How? I know, I can tell you the names of the guys in the band because I liked it, but I never met any of them. Repetition. I set it to music, right? And so now I might not be able to start Every Mother's Son or something like that, but if you start playing it, I want to start getting the words to it because I've heard it so much. You do that with anything. You can learn. We used to teach our kids Bible verses by setting it to tunes. Some of them tunes that that we already knew. Some that we made up for those verses. It's the truth. I am not going to sing it for you, but we set Revelation 20 verse 12 to the tune of Andy Griffith. And it works. And you know what? Every one of the people in my family can quote Revelation 20 and verse 12 because that's the power of repetition set in a way that we've heard it, right? If you listen to the book of Haggai several times, you're going to pick up information that you don't know that you're absorbing. So this is part of taking that book as a whole. And as you listen to the book of Haggai over and over again, what's going to begin to happen? What are you going to begin to hear? You're going to hear themes, right? You're going to hear an overall content of what that book's about. Now, once you get past that, what you'll need to do, and it's easier with a shorter book, take 3 John, take Jude, take a one chapter book. And as you sit down and begin to study that book, you'll start getting specific. Take a piece of paper. And maybe what you can do is you can read it as you hear it. Engage as many of your senses as possible. Now, once you get to that point and you have a notebook in your hand, you'll go through and you begin to jot observations about it. This is what I'm saying. Take chapter 1, and you go through and you begin to notice some things. This is the writer of the book. This is the recipients of the book. This is where it's written to. Sometimes this is where it's written from. All of that's going to help you as you go down through that. Now, this sounds elementary, but how infrequently do we do that? What's the overall thrust of this class? Studying the Bible for all that it's worth. And so I want to bring to bear everything I can to study the book. Now, this is just piece 1. But this is something that we can do over and over again, and we're going to retain, we're going to comprehend. I want you to think about it this way. The letter to the Ephesians, Paul wrote that to the church at Ephesus. Now, they were meant so that when the church at Ephesus was done, and we know this from reading the book of Colossians, in Colossians chapter 4, it says, as for you, you take the epistle to the Laodiceans, and basically Paul's saying in about verse 13 to 17, I want y'all to swap when you're done. Now, I want you to imagine that the church at Ephesus, Timothy's the preacher there, Paul writes the letter to the Ephesians, and Timothy or somebody else in the congregation gets up there and says, all right, Paul's written us a letter. And today what we're going to do is we're just going to go right there. Therefore I beseech you, brethren, that you walk worthy of the Lord, by that vocation with which you were called, in all lowliness and meekness of mind, forbearing one another in love, endeavoring to keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. All right, we'll come back and we'll read a couple of other random places in his letter next week, and then we'll come back and do the same thing. Now, I'm not saying there's not a place for taking it. I do it, right? I don't preach every book every time that I preach. But sometimes we approach Bible study that way. We take a verse here. We take a verse there. We haven't seen it or considered its context. When they read the letter to the Ephesians, you know what they did? They started with Paul, a prisoner of the Lord, to the saints at Ephesus, and read all the way down to the very end of that letter. Our Bible study needs to have a place for that. They were written originally as a whole. They have a message that's unique. They have a theme that's unique to them. So often what we'll do is, for example, you have the apostle, let me think of a good example of that. One that you have, maybe let's say in Ephesians, Paul takes the theme of faith. And we'll try to understand what Paul is saying about faith in Ephesians by going to James's letter and saying, this is what faith in Ephesians means. Well, Paul's using that differently Now, we might want to teach a truth, but we'll make sure we're using the right book in the right place to teach that truth, and not trying to make one writer say what he's not saying in context. Now, I don't want to make everybody nervous in the class. I'm not saying that you got to, anytime you want to quote John 3:16, you go, well, in the context, Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, and he's using this example from the Old Testament. I'm not saying that. I am saying that there is a place in our study to, at some point, know how John 3:16 fits in the context, and then we can proceed from there. All right. As a part of knowing the book as a whole, you don't have to know the culture and the history of the times in order to understand what you're reading. I'm not saying that it's not helpful. And I want to give you some examples of what I'm talking about. We mentioned this last week, but let me mention it in the idea of the book itself is going to help you to understand. We mentioned last week about the veil, right? That there, in the context of 1 Corinthians chapter 11, that Paul is saying to the Corinthians that the women were to wear veils in order to show submission to their husbands. All right? How do we know that that's cultural? I mean, in the context, there is an eternal principle that Paul ties to creation. I want you to know that the head of every man is, of every woman is man. Head of man is Christ. Head of Christ is God. It's an eternal principle, right? Because he ties it to all times. How do you know, just from reading the Bible, that that veil was not something that God placed on all people of all times? Without going to, well, I can read from the first century annals of the history of the ancient world that they, just wore veils in Corinth, or this was a thing that was only to the, ordinary to them. We mentioned this last week. How do you know from the Bible that that's cultural and not to be bound on us today? Well, I guess the elders are going to have to institute a wearing of the veils come Sunday. Huh? What's the answer? Or some of you guys want to see that? No, I was kidding. All right, so we mentioned last week, 1 Timothy 2, a passage that we apply to modest apparel. The Apostle Paul tells Timothy what he means by modest apparel. He says, not the wearing of gold or jewels, or do you remember something else in there? There you go. Some of you were last week, the braiding of hair. How could they look at the church at Ephesus and know those women had braided hair if they had a veil over? Answer is they couldn't. So if there was a different cultural practice in the same century in which Paul is writing to the church at Corinth and saying, I want women here, because apparently there was something going on at Corinth, we could deduce, we could look at some other material and say that the temple prostitutes went about with their, I've heard that, so you maybe have heard that said before. Okay, that's fine and dandy, but we really don't need that. What we need is 1 Timothy 2, 9 and 10, 1 Peter 3, 3 and 4, that shows us other contexts culturally where women women wore their hair a different way, had different instructions so that you don't have one thing, right? Does that make sense? Do you see how you don't need the ancient Greek books to help you to decipher, or you don't need some brother to come along, write a tract, and cause trouble in congregations with something that we can determine internally? Let me give you another example with regard to that. Holy kiss. Greet one another with a holy kiss. Same passage where we say the churches of Christ salute you. There's the biblical designation of the name that we wear. So are we bound to greet one another with a holy kiss? I know you know that we know the answer, but how do we determine that? How do we know that? Oh, good. This class is necessary. I'm glad. I mean, if I can help to steer us in that regard. What does Paul say in Galatians? I extend unto you, anybody know, in fellowship, the right hand of fellowship. Okay, so he greeted them, extended fellowship to them in a way other than that. We have other styles of greeting. So it's not the particular custom, the kiss, but the greeting one another. that we see being done in different contexts. Let me show you why that's important. That may sound nitpicky. It may seem in some way that's difficult for us to grasp the importance of it. 2019. No, let's see. Was it 2016? Is that right? I think it was. By the way, a buddy of mine, when I was still in Colorado, he said, hey, the Rockies are playing the Giants, and I've got tickets, I've got points I can use for you, so why don't you fly out and watch them play. And it's a neat place to watch a baseball game out there. It used to be Candlestick Park. It's called AT&T, I think now. Whatever it is, the baseball park. And went there. It was June 28th, I think, 2016. You know what that was also? First of all, you're in San Francisco. It was Gay Pride Day there, and it was the day that the U.S. Supreme Court passed the law that legalized federally gay marriage. You know, I'd like anything that was my wife I was there with, not some other dude, you know, because anyway, that's another story. That has nothing to do with this. But people are saying that marriage can be between two men and two women. How do we know that that's not so? From the Bible. Because we have a culture saying that there's something else. How do we know that this is not a cultural matter, that this is a normative, this is a matter that's for all people of all times? That's why it's important. Matthew 19, Jesus is being asked about marriage. And on the occasion, the Pharisees are coming up and they're saying, is it lawful for you to divorce your wife for any cause? And Jesus begins his answer by saying, do you not know that he who made them from the beginning, here's Jesus in one culture, right? First century, saying, do you not know, you in this culture, not know that he who made them from the beginning, he's taking them back to the Garden of Eden, made them male and female. We know he's in a different culture now because he says, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they two shall be one. So we have a pattern that goes beyond just the culture of time. Let me give you another example. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, the Apostle Paul is talking to, and we'll talk about how you determine the purpose of a book. I was thinking it's tonight, it might be another week. We'll get to it real soon. But you have the Apostle Paul who is giving roles for people in the church. He starts with men. And he says not everybody can lead, not every man can lead in worship. He said, I want men who are praying, who lift holy hands without wrath and doubting. Okay? That prayer in the context of those who are up before the congregation, Paul's not saying, but you can lead singing with wrathful hands and doubting hands and unholy hands. No, he's not saying that. What applies to prayer would apply to everything that you would do standing before others. And so if you have somebody who's living an unrighteous, unholy life, Monday through Saturday, he's not to be leading in worship. It is unscriptural for him to lead in worship. If he is wrathful, if he is a man who is a spinning tornado out in the world, you don't have him to lead in worship. He's not scripturally qualified. Now, after he gets through with that, he moves to the woman. And he gives a command with regard to whether or not women can lead in worship. And I've heard people say, to explain why Paul was restricting women in this text. Well, there were women who were involved in temple worship in Ephesus. And they had gone from being priestesses in that culture to coming into the church. And so the Apostle Paul is trying to correct a cultural problem. And so he tells them that they have got to be quiet because they were taking over the services. And so he laid down that restriction. There's only one question we've got to ask. Where do you see that in the text? I'm talking about college professors in our Christian colleges who will use that line of argumentation. I'm not saying all of them, I've heard it there. Who to try to say, that's why in 2019, in our more enlightened culture, where things are different than they were in the first century, that's why we can expand that and allow women to lead in worship. All we've got to do is go what Paul says in 1 Timothy 2, 11 and 12. But again, this is like every mother's son. If you get me started on it, I can remember the rest of it. What does Paul say in verse 11?
A woman must not.
Okay, a woman must not teach or have authority over the man, but must learn in entire quietness? That's the NPV, the Neal Pollard version.
Silence is also Christian. I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man that is silent.
All right, keep reading though.
For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman, being deceived, fell into transgression. Nevertheless,
Okay, that's far enough just for the point that we're trying to make here. Why does Paul say that a woman is not to teach or to have authority? It's not because she's not talented enough. It's not because she's not smarter than man. It's not because of any of those kinds of reasons. The reason that Paul gives, he's in the first century. He is speaking to that culture. But what does he do to establish that this is not a cultural matter? Jeremy read it.
He bypasses the law and culture.
He bypasses the law of the culture and goes to another culture. And he establishes a principle. This is not just for this culture. This is for cultures. And if it's for cultures, if you can look back 4,000 years in that instance, what about if you look forward 2,000 years? This is a dispensational truth. For all, as long as there are stands, this is true for all people of all time. Do you see how we didn't go to history books and outside the Bible in order to establish this? All we need to do when we're studying a book is to use the historical information in that book and the truth that's taught in that book in order to establish it. If you were on an island by yourself and all you had was the Bible, would that be enough for you to learn what God wants you to do? That being the case, everything that we need. Now, are we benefited if it's a good resource outside the Bible? Sure it is. But we're not reliant upon it. Otherwise, the very things that we said in the first week, God says, I wrote this book so you can understand what the will of the Lord is. Ephesians 5 and verse 17. I want you to come to the knowledge of the truth. 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 4. All Scripture, it makes you complete so that you're lacking in nothing. 2 Timothy 3, 16 and 17. A couple other principles before I leave this. There's not a book of the Bible where the first chapter and the last chapter do not fit together. That is, in other words, you're going to see things that recur. You're going to see ideas that recur. And there is a thread running throughout that. Let me just give you a couple of examples. We could do all 66, but I'm already kind of taking more time than I want to. The book of Matthew. Okay? If you need to turn there, it's fine, but maybe you can think, what happens in Matthew chapter 1? Anybody remember anything that happens? Genealogies. Remember what else happens? And the genealogy is very important, what I'm talking about. But what else? What else happens in Matthew 1? Right after the genealogy, you got the 3:14. Say it again. The birth of Christ. All right? And the information that comes along with the birth of Christ, how do we find out about it? How does that revealed in the book of Matthew chapter 1? Just what does the text say? So you're there in that section. Maybe you have a section headed.
Verse 18 says, now the birth of Jesus Christ was as follows.
Okay. All right, and then what does it say after that?
Well, that's how it introduces it.
Yep, that's it.
After his mother Mary was betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Spirit.
So here's what Matthew goes in the genealogies. All right, you're going to walk through some who's who of the Israelite history. Then you get to Christ. Now the birth of Jesus was on this wise: a woman, a virgin, before she is married, conceives a child of the Holy Spirit. Does that happen every day? No, because what's Matthew trying to do? He's trying to establish that Jesus is the Messiah. The book of Matthew is written to show proofs that Jesus is the Messiah that they've been longing for. That's Matthew chapter 1, kind of in a synopsis. You get to chapter 28. And what's chapter 28 about? What happens in 28?
Ascension.
Okay, before that, let's kind of walk through it.
All authority.
Okay, that's the takeaway. All right, all authority is given to him, and that's important. Kind of stole my thunder.
The resurrection.
The resurrection happens first. That's good. Resurrection, appearances, Great Commission. That's how it goes. So, Matthew chapter 1 is establishing what about Jesus?
Messiah.
He's the Messiah through things like proofs, like the genealogies, like Jesus was born of a virgin. And then you get to chapter 28, Jesus is raised from the dead. He appears to various witnesses, And then he ends by saying, all authority is given me in heaven. What's Matthew still doing in Matthew 28? He is establishing to the Jews primarily, but also we get the application from it, that Jesus is the promised Messiah of the Old Testament. And because of that, now he's making application. He has all authority, and what he tells us to do, we are to do. My only point in all that is, Matthew 1, Matthew 28 are both talking about the same thing, and you draw a thread through the book. What do you think the book of Matthew is talking about all the way through? Jesus is proven as the Messiah, and he is the one that's being expected through these various proofs that take place. I know there's James, and I won't go as deep into this just because of the sake of time. I encourage you to look in James 1 and look in James 5, and I found 12 subjects that James is talking about in James chapter 1 that he is also talking about in James chapter 5. I'll just give you an example. Patience, endurance, joy, prayer, being complete, sin, riches. All right? So here's the question. Why are these mentioned again in chapter 5 if he mentions all of them in chapter 1? Essentially, more needs to be said about the subject. He is introducing these ideas in chapter 1, and often you'll find at the end of books, what the author is doing is he's making application. Do you remember there are 3 elements to studying the Bible for all it's worth? Step number 1 is what? It's the IOA. What's the I step? In any book study.
Investigate.
So it is by itself what? Raw
Information.
It's information. So you have information first. James is giving us information on prayer, on riches, on being made complete, on patience, on endurance. With information, you've also, with observation, you've also got to do what? See, I messed y'all up with it. Observation. All right. Observation, that's what I didn't plan to teach that night. Observation, then what's next? Okay, that's the bottom line. What's that I in the middle? It does start with an I. Interpretation. And then when you get to the end of it, as John said, application. What's James doing with that information from chapter 1? He's making application. Right? But you're going to find that thread throughout the book. We want to find out what these books are about. And so the first thing we've got to do is to look at the book itself as a whole. I want to do just one thing with Hebrews. I have a whole lot more material on Hebrews. I'm not being a good time manager. But when you talk about the book of Hebrews, we've heard this before. What's, generally speaking, what's the book of Hebrews about? Jesus is better. Okay? That's right. That's good. Now, what we can do in studying the Bible for all it's worth is we can go deeper into that. The book of Hebrews gives you some kind of a hint. Who is the writer trying to tell that Jesus is better? The Jews. We know that because what? A Jew is a Hebrew, right? That's a term of description for a Jew. Now, we're going to go a step further. See what we're doing? We're drilling down. We're giving the Bible an even deeper look. Hebrews is Jesus is better. It's written to Jews. Why?
Jesus is a Jew.
Okay, Jesus is a Jew, sure. And that's helpful, and it's very important to what we're going to see in just a moment. But why did these Jews need to know that Jesus is better? They're trying to go back to keep the law?
They didn't believe he was the Messiah.
Okay, or at least they were questioning it, because some of these are folks who had come to Christ and they were going back to the law, or to Judaism. Now, as a part of this, you may remember in about chapter 5 and verse 12 through chapter 6 and verse 1, right there in the middle of that book, it's probably not a verse that we look at often in the book of Hebrews. The Hebrews writer says, for the time that you ought to be teachers, now not of the law, but teachers regarding Christ, because you're Christians. You have need again to be taught what are the first principles of the oracles of God. Now, we can make application from that. We should. That we need to grow to the point that we are not mere learners all the time, but that we can teach others. Very important. That's an application. That's not what the Hebrews writer is saying in context. He's saying to these Jews, He's saying you can only take milk. You don't know the deeper things. Now, what are we talking about? Get to Hebrews chapter 6 and verse 1. You need to leave those elementary principles. When you look at the old law, when you look at the Old Testament scriptures, if you're this kind of Jew that the writer's writing about, what did they see in the Old Testament? Law stuff. What is the writer telling them that they should have seen in the Old Testament? The Messiah stuff. Now, here's a cool thing, all right? And we won't have a chance to drill down on this. From Hebrews 3 through Hebrews chapter 10, that's a lot of the book. That's the heart of the book of Hebrews. The Hebrews writer only is basically arguing from 3 Old Testament passages. And that's not the only 3 verses that he mentions in the book of Hebrews, but he just drills down on those, and he just drives a point home that's inescapable for these folks who all they're seeing, Stephen, is the law, the old law. They're not seeing the Messiah stuff. And so in chapter 3 and 4, he takes one passage, Psalm 95, 7 through 11, and he says this is about Christ. It's masterful. He goes to chapter 5 through 7, and the transitional passage there is Psalm 110, 1 and 4. Do you remember in that Hebrews 5 passage, he starts to talk about Melchizedek, and he says, I want to say more about this, but you're not ready for it. You're still drinking the milk of the old law stuff. Well, guess who is mentioned in Psalm 110? It's only one of a few places in the Bible. Spoiler alert, it's Melchizedek. All right, from chapter 5 through chapter 7, he takes Psalm 110 in verse 1 and verse 4, and he drives home the point, this is about Jesus. And then in Hebrews chapter 8 and verse 1, he says, now the things that we've been talking about in chapters 5 through 7, this is what it's about. It's about Jesus. And then the handoff passage is in chapter 8 and verse 6. 8 through 10 is basically an expanding of Jeremiah 31 through 34. Now there's the heart of the book of Hebrews. If I want to see it as a whole, I want to see what the writer's doing. And what he's doing through doing that is showing this law that you can only teach Judaism from has been pointing ahead to Jesus the whole time. That being the case, why would you leave Jesus to go back to that? Now, our point tonight is not to make the rich application from that we can make, one of which we've already made. My point is, how do you get to that point? The very things that we're talking about. You take that book of Hebrews and you begin reading it. You begin listening to it. Get out your paper and your pen, and as you walk through, you're going to see words that repeat. You're going to see themes that begin to develop. For example, in our Hebrews example, the word forever is a word that is used throughout the book of Hebrews. But I ask you, if you want to do some second mile homework, see how it's used in chapters 5 through 7 to make that point. Now, let me introduce the next thing. I think I can get here. If the book is the biggest way to look at it, what's a smaller way to look at any book of the Bible to try to understand? That book is going to be comprised of a bunch of what? Okay, chapters. Now, who did the chapters for us? Man did. All right? So if we want to drill down to the next level of what's there and hasn't been imposed on it, you have to go smaller than chapters. Paragraphs. All right, so that's what we want to do next. We want to go from the entirety of the book. We want to be familiar with that. But as we want to drill down and understand it better, we're going to get down to the paragraph, right? All right, so there are some things we're looking for in any paragraph, right? To try to understand what's in that paragraph, what are some things we're looking for in a unit that size?
Theme.
Okay, a theme. And how do we determine what that theme is? What are some ways that we can do that? There are going to be some things that are going to occur in that paragraph that will help us to get to that. For example, questions and answers, right? You'll find in any number of Bible paragraphs questions that are being answered. How can a man be born when he's old? It's in the middle of a paragraph. How do you marvel that I say that you must be born again? Questions. Answers are given to those. General and specific. an example of that. Paul says in Galatians 5:15, and this I say unto you, walk in the Spirit, you'll not fulfill the desires of the flesh. Now, if I just take that verse, and I'm not looking at it in this paragraph, how do I answer the question of what it means to walk in the Spirit so as not to, and you know what, sometimes when we get into religious discussions, we'll be talking about something like this with somebody, and you ask them, well, what does it mean to walk in the Spirit? And they'll go off on, maybe you're looking at this passage, and they'll go off 100 different directions. Now, all we need to do is say, what does the Bible say? Right? Isn't that what we want to be doing? Is to say, we don't really need to throw out opinions or guesses. It's right there in the text. And what Paul does is he goes from the general, walk by the Spirit and you'll not fulfill the desires of the flesh. You know what comes right after that in verse 19 through 21? I think somebody said it. 22 and 23 we know because we sing it in Vacation Bible School. It's not a kumquat. It's not a carrot or a tomato or whatever. It's love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. That's how you don't fulfill the lust of the desires of the flesh and the mind. That's how you walk by the Spirit. I don't have to guess that. It's in the context. So what's the desires of the flesh and of the mind? They're in verse 19 through 21. Now the lusts of the flesh are manifest, which are. And you have that big long list there. Can I give you 4 other things before I turn you loose if you're taking notes? 3 other things to determine what a paragraph's about. Look at dialogue. More examples than I can give you. Jesus or someone else having a conversation. Philip and the eunuch. Jesus and Nicodemus. Purpose statements. You'll find it all the time when you're going through a paragraph. Therefore, that, so that. Those are purpose statements. Psalm 119, verse 11. Your word have I hid in my heart, that I may not sin against you. All right, and then the last is a conditional clause. That's a clause that presents the conditions by which something will happen. If anyone is in Christ, what? You may know, he is a new creature. Conditional statement. I want to be a new creature. How does it happen? I must be in Christ. See? All right. We'll stop there. We're going to deal with, I'll tell you where we're going, sentences and words. And y'all pray for me that I want to be a truth teller. We are going to get to the 4 P's next class.